This week, we flash back to 2011 for part one of a two-review series called Justifiable Homicide, in which we discuss comics about murdering a murderer. This week's topic is Nexus by Mike Baron and Steve Rude. Nexus is the story of a far future in which a man kills mass murderers, not out of revenge, but because he feels forced to in self-defense. My brother Paul joins me to review. This episode was originally published on August 15th, 2011. We hope you'll spread the word about Deconstructing Comics. Tell your friends about us, share episodes on social media, and also send us suggestions for topics we could cover. Email us at mail@deconstructingcomics.com. This is Tim, and this is Deconstructing Comics. So, for the first time in about a year and a half, my brother Paul is back.
How's it going, eh?
Yeah.
It's hard to believe it's been that long since we did the Johnny Cash podcast.
Yeah. I see a darkness or brightness or whatever it was. Darkness, yeah.
Yeah, it's got to be darkness. If it's Johnny Cash, the Man in Black, it can't be brightness.
I think I called the episode "We See a Brightness" because we liked the book, but. Way back, longer ago than I care to give a number for, when I was just finishing high school, we both got into a series called Nexus, written by Mike Baron and drawn by Steve Rude, and there were, I guess we came in really on the first color issue.
Yeah, I didn't see any of the three issues that were published in black and white in 81 and 82 by Capital, the now defunct company, until 85, when first published the original Nexus, was the title, as the first three black and white issues. So we didn't see those at all. There's mention of them in several of the first few issues that Capital published in color, in regular comic book size. Mm-hmm. In fact, there's a lot of reference to them being sold out. Like issues 1 and 2 were unfindable for the chunk of the 80s because Capital and then First just didn't handle them. And when Capital went out of business, I guess whatever spare copies there were probably just floated into the market. Now the magazines are pretty easy to find. Lone Star lists all three issues for pretty reasonable prices. Mm-hmm. It's not really an expensive investment unless you try to find perfect, like 9.4 mint copies. Actually, any fanboy listening to this would know that 9.4 is far from mint copies. It's only near mint. I was able to find them. I think even like a 9.4 copy of the first issue would probably cost you between $20 and $30. Not terrible. But the issues are the black and white comics are kind of interesting because issue 1 or 2, I don't remember which, had a poster, a fold-out poster. And, of course, that issue is worth more if the poster is intact in the Overstreet Guide. And then issue 3 had a flexi disc, which was then affectionately called the Flexi Nexi. It was a soundtrack that was recorded by some friends of Steve Rude's, and then the music was by a friend of Rude's, the artists. And then they had other people doing the voices, and so there's a full soundtrack to issue 3. It's actually not bad. I was able to download it as an MP3 from Steve Rude's website. It's steverudeart.com. For 99 cents, I got the Flexi, the tape from which the Flexi was taken. And it's not bad. It's not bad. The voices are kind of fun, and they give Horatio, that is Nexus, a little kid's voice through, the point at which he's clearly a teenager in the comic. He was saying, "I don't believe that you didn't know where my mother was." It's like, yes, Henry Aldrich. That was a little confusing, but the rest of it's interesting. But we came in on the color issue, the first color issue from Capital in 1983 would have been.
Yeah, I was thinking it was 83. Somewhere I saw it was late 82, but I associate it with 83, around the time I graduated from high school.
Uh-huh.
Well, we should say a little bit about what Nexus is, what it's about. So Nexus, or Horatio Hellpop, he wears a costume that looks like a superhero costume, but I mean, it's not really a superhero book. It's more of a science fiction book. And he, I should mention, Paul's got our original copies from back in the Dark Ages. I've got
back when CDs were young.
CDs weren't even out yet. Nexus As It Happened, Volume 1, published by Rude Dude, which is Steve Rude's publishing imprint. And I guess this came out at the end of 2009. And it's a nice economical way to get this stuff, $9.99. It's the first 3 black and white issues and the only 3 black and white issues, and then the first 4 color issues, unfortunately in black and white, and reproduced somewhat smaller than the original. But yeah, I could enjoy the stories anyway. But it starts out with Nexus kills someone, but the person that he kills is someone who was a mass murderer. But then what's interesting is that he says it's not for revenge, it's self-defense. He's not interested in revenge. And then so you're like, okay, well, what? He's killing a mass murderer and it's not revenge. Okay, so what's going on here? And then we find that he has dreams that tell him to kill certain mass murderers. I guess only humans, right? I mean, this is in space in the year 2841, according to the back cover of the book. So, I mean, there are various other life forms involved in the story, but I think it's stated somewhere that he only kills human mass murderers.
That may be right. I'm not sure about that. There's the slaver, whatever. I don't remember his name. The one who has decapitated all of these heads. Yeah, Clausius, who is the same race as Mesro, the little kid who is defacing Nexus's ship with graffiti when Nexus picks him up and decides to take him back to Ilum. The planet Ilum, where Nexus lives, he's turned into a colony for political refugees, like political exiles, members of races who were decimated by various mass murderers. Mm-hmm. Clausius isn't human, mm-hmm. but I don't remember at all. I read the first 7 color issues, first the 5 Capital comics, and then the first 2 issues when it went to First Comics before it hit Dark Horse. It bounced around even more than we might have remembered. But I'm not sure about that. I mean, if you're right that he only kills humans, then that puts an interesting kind of limit on and another mystery into the fire. I think that's what's kind of fascinating about the comic. Maybe this is why you and I got into it right away, Tim, is that there's a lot of unanswered questions. Mm-hmm. You don't know why he's killing this character in self-defense. That's a big, for anybody reading that first issue. And I think it was a brilliant one because it gets people hooked, even if the Capital black and white issues didn't look all that professional. Steve Rude's art is pretty much fan art for those first 2 issues in particular. Mm-hmm. Heads are really blocky and faces are not very well perspectively drawn. But by the first color issue, he's clearly been working really, really hard to sort of tighten up his style. There's a real looseness in the black and white issues of, the way he draws anatomy that's really pleasing, but it's wrong. The anatomy is not believable. But then, and with the first color issue, his perspective is right. He draws, I think, heads from above and below with faces in proper perspective better than just about any comic artist working today, as far as I can tell. Mm-hmm. It looks like he actually studied humans instead of being only, shall we say, what's his name, who drew the first New Mutants issue with Deadpool in it.
Liefeld?
Rob Liefeld, yes. Sorry, Rob Liefeld, but I can't. It's hard for me to believe that you've ever actually drawn from life. Anyway.
But as I said, I can only see them in black and white here. But as I recall, also the color was really well done in those issues. I don't know if Rude colored it, but I recall that it had kind of almost painted texture to it.
It did in a time when anything but just flat comic book newsprint color was pretty much the law of the land. Holding this up to Tim so we can see at least a little bit of the gradation.
Right, through Skype, I'm looking at the colored comic from 1983, and it looks really good.
Yeah, it really does. The color separations are nice. So originally, George Freeman, who co-created Captain Canuck in Canada, was the colorist, and he did the color separations. And according to Richard Bruning's editorial in the opening, it was a kind of color separation process that was really revolutionary for its time. But I don't know enough about color separation to know what that means. But I can tell you that gradations from like deep blue to like a kind of a light green as a suggestion of a night sky over a city are done. You almost can't tell the gradations. There are moments where you can tell them a little bit better, but it's clearly a lot more sophisticated than printing on like newsprint at Marvel in 1983, let's say. Mm-hmm. And then Les Dorscheid took over when the comic moved to First. And Les Dorscheid is also an artist, and he drew some issues of Nexus after Rude left, way forward and beyond the scope of this Skype conversation. But yeah, it's a really beautiful book, and he did a fair amount of work with just like there's a dream image of Dave, that is the Thune, the kind of ape-like being who is incredibly intelligent and also Nexus's best friend. There's a rendering of him as his son Judah the Hammer announces that his father's name was Dave, and this is a big reveal because it turns out that these two characters are related and haven't seen each other for decades. But there's an image of Dave sort of hovering over Judah's head as he says, "My father's name was Dave," that's rendered entirely in color. It's like paint rather than a line drawing. And so that's pretty sophisticated stuff. So it's a book that was really flashy. Mm-hmm. And looked really good. And that might be one of the things that attracted us to it.
I'm sure it was. Yeah.
Because there's no underestimating how unusual it was to see a really slick-looking, color comic book on the stands. And it cost $1.75 in 1983. And
Marvel stuff was still under $1 then, I believe.
I suppose it was 50 cents by then. Yeah, so that was a big investment, but it seemed to be worth it.
Oh yeah.
At the time.
Mm-hmm. As we're talking about the art here, and I was flipping through the book before we started. I was looking near the end of the last black and white issue. There's and the page composition of there's a spread there near the end of there's a backup feature in there too. But the end of the main story, where Nexus is fighting Sutilla Burke.
You talking about this? It's a 2-page spread of the heads.
Yeah, well, like the top row, you see Nexus and Sutilla Burke close up, kind of shooting at each other, and then the far shot of them shooting at each other, and the energy meeting in the middle, and then these are all panels that are going all the way across the page.
Two magazine
the 2 pages across the spread. And then there's a big scene, like the center panel of the spread, showing this huge hall where all of these decapitated heads, they're enslaved living decapitated heads. What a plot point.
Well, they're used like batteries to run this plasma ship, this plasma run ship, and so they're sort of forced to be kind of telepathic, telekinetic, but they're complete slaves, right? They have no independent thought when they're in this tank. But yeah, it's a pretty chilling image.
Yeah, so the far shot of all these rows of heads in the capsules that they're in, and then a close-up of a row of them. And then at the bottom, there are 3 panels as this fight is continuing, and stars. They're drawing their energy from stars, and some stars are burning out in the distance. This is really far shot in space. But it's so much information on this spread, and so clearly understandable.
Mm-hmm.
It's really nice.
Yeah, it's nice. It's symmetrical, so it's pleasing to look at. It's does the job of both opposing these two kind of powerhouse cosmic creatures who are like blasting each other with these plasma rays.
Mm-hmm.
It shows the contrast there by having them kind of mirroring each other on the left and right side of the page. But then that symmetrical lineup or that symmetrical arrangement allows Rude to move down and show us these wide shots in the same panel configuration and width. Mm-hmm. Of the kind of horror of having all of these decapitated heads enslaved. If you've seen Futurama, you got to wonder whether the creators of Futurama had read Nexus at some point, because there are all these decapitated heads floating around in like Soylent Green juice. But except there, it's a kind of cryogenic freezing, preparation, right? Their heads were sawn off and preserved so that someday their bodies could be cloned, and apparently it didn't work. So in the year 3000, people are just floating around as heads. In fact, Richard Nixon's decapitated head is the president of the United States, and the president of the planet, really, in that book. Mm. But getting into one of the reasons for this podcast in the first place, one of the things that this kind of artwork, it's really clear, you're right, it's not likely that fan art, is going to be so clear and kind of minimalist in its communication of an idea. Often fan art is really elaborate and, it's trying to fit in lots of details and suggest that that's quality. But this has much more kind of Scott McCloud, just clarity and brevity about it. Mm-hmm. That's the idea across really nicely. But the other thing is, here you get a sense of the horror of what various mass murderers and slavers have done, those very targets that Nexus dreams about, mm-hmm. and then those dreams cause him, he's in deep pain until he goes and kills the mass murderer who appears to him in his dream. Mm-hmm. So there's a sense of kind of cosmic justice, like somehow this poor guy, Horatio Hellpop III, has ended up as the kind of both the hero of the oppressed and the victim of some larger cosmic force that's forcing him to kill mass murderers. And so here we get a sense that, the devastation is incredible, that perhaps there's something really just about him, Nexus going off and executing people who do things like this to other people. But then we get into the question that you posed when you talked with me about what to do with this podcast, and that is the kind of rightness of the eye for an eye justice of, killing a murderer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he's a completely unwilling mercenary, basically, and when the dream doesn't tell him to kill somebody, he really seems to be a pacifist. And you mentioned Judah Maccabee, Dave, who was revealed to be Dave's son, who has modeled himself on Nexus, believing that Nexus is a willing avenger of the people, the victims of these mass murderers, and has taken it upon himself to do the same thing. And Nexus is like, kind of, oh, gee, I created him. He says that in there. And so, he doesn't take any. He's only doing it to ease the pain from the dreams. He's not, as he says at the beginning, he's not doing it for revenge. And he doesn't even seem to believe in doing it that way. Plus, there are cases where, well, like near the end of this book, in the fourth color issue, where he has to kill this woman, this elderly woman who hasn't killed anyone in 30 years, and she's sort of, maybe you could say she's reformed somewhat, but she has to die, or his dreams are not going to stop. Or I guess that I saw this in Wikipedia, but I guess there are also cases where someone didn't realize that their actions had caused mass death, completely unaware of what they'd done, but still they got to die. Mm-hmm. And is that justice when they don't know that they committed a crime?
Right. Yeah, that's it's a great kind of sci-fi question. And a lot of well, maybe not a lot, but there's certainly some kind of basic texts of the science fiction canon that have that, the kind of they give us a lot of elaborate atmosphere and a new environment, and they build really interesting worlds, but they're really about like basic ethical issues, like when does someone actually deserve to die, whether they intended to kill other people or not, and who gets to decide. Clockwork Orange is the one I'm thinking of, the kind of one of those canonical sci-fi texts, both the novel and the film. Where Alex, the main character, is just a horrible bastard, and he has this team of goons his droogies that he drags around London, pretty much like raping and pillaging, quite literally, and accidentally killing a few people along the way. And then he is taken up by the justice system, and Alex is forced to undergo this treatment that gives him aversion to anything violent. But because they're playing Beethoven, his favorite musician, his favorite composer, during the films that they show him in his aversion therapy, these films of brutality, they're supposed to give him a kind of Pavlovian reaction against violence that will make him throw up when he gets violent, and so he has to stop. Because they're playing Beethoven for some reason during his experimental treatments, he then Beethoven makes him sick too, and so he no longer even can enjoy the beauty that he enjoys from art, which gives us another question: what's the relationship between art and behavior? If someone this horribly violent can actually love beautiful, like romantic classical music, but then in the end, I think the film especially is really kind of pushing on the idea that whoever, this kind of mistake, that is that you make someone hate even that which they love, which others would love too, Beethoven music in this case, if that kind of mistake can be made by humans trying to adjust other humans' behavior through the penal system, whether it's by death or by drugs in this case, or by the experimental treatment in the sci-fi story, is it really just for us, for others to, people to judge others at all? Here's what the aftermath might be. There's, and of course, in the end, the treatment doesn't do any good, at least in the film. Alex is still, wants to do nothing but, have lots of sex with anyone he wants, whether they like it or not. So, but the question, it's a very simple question about morality and about justice, but it gets played out in this really elaborate kind of framework where, because it's sci-fi, the authors can set up situations to test, both the characters' morality and our feelings about, these kinds of judgments.
Mm-hmm. So a few other things I wanted to mention, particularly about Barron's writing. I felt like he's maybe deliberately trying to resist cliches. In that very first scene of the first black and white, when the first murder that we see Nexus commit, and the mass murderer's wife or girlfriend, we're not sure, she jumps in and tries to get between Nexus and her husband, and we've seen so many examples of where then the wife is accidentally shot instead. But here, Nexus shoots his beam, and it goes like at right angles over her head and back down and hits the guy. And I certainly have not seen that before.
Yeah, that strikes me as a great moment of like, okay, if you're reading this book and you've never seen Steve Rude's artwork before and you don't care that much about it, at that point you think, this guy has an imagination. Mm-hmm. But you're right. The woman just doesn't end up just being kind of cannon fodder or a chance for a little pathos in the story. Mm-hmm. She got accidentally killed. She ends up being primarily she's still a kind of plot device, but the point of her is to have someone in the room say, this was a good man. Right? She never knew this dictatorial figure when he was a mass murderer in Paraguay. She only knew him after that and didn't know anything about his past because he disguised his identity. So she says, why? He did no great evil. He was a good man. And Nexus says, I could convince you otherwise, but it would serve no purpose. So she, she serves a different kind of plot purpose, but it seems like a much more kind of narratively mature one than just, a moment of, oh my God, you killed my wife. This is horrible.
By the way, as an aside, I'll never forgive. I don't even remember who the writer was, but the Wolverine Origin miniseries that came out some years ago, that was the ending. The girl that he was in love with jumped in front of the gun or whatever, and she died. I'm like, oh, come on. That's the payoff of this miniseries, of the origin we've been waiting decades for? Give me a break.
Yeah, it's like, great. Dr. Zhivago, exactly what I was hoping for.
But another avoided cliche was, so we didn't talk about Sundra Peel yet, who shows up saying she's a reporter and is trying to learn about Nexus and becomes his girlfriend eventually. And then
I would say eventually. It happens pretty quickly. By the first or second color issue, it's pretty well established that they're together.
Yeah. But then it turns out that she wasn't a reporter. I'm not going to completely spoil it, but she wasn't what she said she was. But she's... It's really a non-issue. There isn't any "you betrayed me" type of scene. Nexus never really even comments on it or kind of notices it even. It just kind of goes by.
Yeah. I mean, everything is kind of forgiven, I guess, without there being a big point made of it. In one of the early black and white issues, or maybe it's the first color issue, Harlan Ellison, that famous crank of sci-fi and comic book fame, wrote in and said, I really love this stuff. I think it's really inventive. It's imaginative. The ethical issues you're dealing with are spectacularly interesting, but you're not giving enough dramatic weight to things like what the heads are going to do with the rest of their lives once they've been saved. He says, you can't just dismiss that and say, well, they'll get on with their lives in a single balloon, like a single word balloon. You've got to give us some more depth to this. And Barron says, it's hard for me to understand why anybody would think that we're just going to skip that. That was just where we were at that point in the plot. Well, that was all we could do there. And of course it's going to have a chance to unfold. So he actually kind of chastises Harlan Ellison a little bit, even though Harlan Ellison is clearly a hero of Mike Barron's. He says, just wait. It's not like we're dismissing this. And I think there's a kind of savvy about how to put together a serial story as opposed to like writing a novel or a short story that Barron has right away. That is, plant stuff. Plant is interesting little character tidbits, interesting little plot twists that then you can develop ad infinitum. Like in the very first 3 issues, we've already got hints that there are people living, like political exiles living on Ilum, who desperately want Nexus to kill their quote-unquote dictator, the one who destroyed their race. And Nexus says, not going to do it. I love you guys. I want you here. This is what Ilum is all about, is about giving you a place to live and thrive, but I'm not going to arm your revolution. And I'm not going to kill somebody just because you tell me so. That's not my problem. So, Nexus has this kind of cosmic imperiousness. He's kind of like Galactus in a way, in that sense, but much more human than Galactus. He also has, because he is human, Nexus has his own ethical quagmires to sort of wade through. And it's very easy for him in the opening to just say, okay, I kill people whom I'm told to kill by my dreams, but I don't kill anybody else. And so even though he briefly considers taking Suttle Burke up on the offer to take away his dreams if he will just kill on contract, at the last minute, Nexus changed his mind and said, no, that's not the way this works. But, but from the very beginning, we've got characters who are saying, Nexus, you got to kill this guy for me. And Nexus saying, no, I'm just not going to do it. I don't care how many people he killed. He wasn't in my dream, whoever that dictator was. But then immediately we've got Tyrone, the guy with the shark head and the missing like prosthetic blast leg. He's got a, he's missing a foot. And so he's got a kind of thruster on one leg that keeps him, stable and also allows him to like blast open people's torsos with his leg. But he turns out to be a kind of revolutionary who wants to take Nexus's stuff if Nexus won't, go and kill people that he wants Nexus to kill, he will like take Nexus's armaments and go off and like be a mercenary on his own. And that happens over and over again in the series, and it builds to some pretty untenable proportions, maybe 20 or 30 issues down the road. So, but Baron doesn't give it all away in the beginning. He allows these problems to unfold slowly to the point where, and this is where Dostoevsky comes in. Nexus is originally reading Dostoevsky, while he's in exile after his father, who, by the way, turns out to be a mass murderer too, and Nexus's first kill. But Nexus has to find this out from Alpha and Beta, his very strange friends who seem to be associated with his dreams in some way. These aliens that just tell him what to do initially. When he's living with his father in exile, after his father destroys essentially a planet in order to save it, quote, he reads Dostoevsky, he reads Mark Twain, he reads all the kind of classical Russian novelists of the 19th century, who, especially Dostoevsky, are really fascinated with justice and fascinated with a kind of almost a Nietzschean idea of whether people who understand themselves better than other people understand themselves have a right to their own morality. Like they have, so do we have, if you're superior mentally and psychologically to others, do you have a right to make judgments that others don't get to make because you can see somehow their ethics more clearly? Notes from Underground is about that. That's the only Dostoevsky novel I've ever read with much in much depth. I've taught it a few times. But Crime and Punishment is very much the same kind of story about someone who believes that he has a right to kill his landlord because his landlady is horrible to him and is not allowing him to sort of blossom into the intellectual he hopes he can be. Those kinds of questions of whether one has the right to make superior decisions and to see things as cut and dried because you're more powerful than others is kind of the story of Nexus, right? He begins having very cut and dried rules. I kill you, I don't kill you. But as things go on, I mean, he has his Elvis period, his fat Elvis period, where he actually ends up drinking and partying all the time and looking more and more like fat bacon sandwich eating Elvis because he just can't take it anymore. But there are other less funny iterations of his struggle. This decision that, just because the dreams are telling me what to do, does that make it right? Is it, can I be better than that? Can I try self-defense in some other way that stops the dreams? Or rather, can I resist it and maybe have some kind of showdown with the cosmic forces that are causing me to do this?
Yeah, and by the way, he's becoming a mass murderer himself as this goes on.
Something I didn't notice when we were kids, even though I was totally blown away by this comic, because I wanted to be an independent cartoonist myself and sort of do my own edgy thing. And I love the fact that these small companies were producing these gorgeous comics. But I think what I notice now that I didn't notice then is that very issue. Like Nexus is becoming a mass murderer. When Judah first describes himself as a mercenary who's living in the shadow of Nexus, he kills a few people in his first two appearances in the first couple of color issues of Nexus. And it occurred to me that, maybe Judah is somebody that Nexus is eventually going to have to kill because he's killed maybe not as many people as the 4 billion people killed by Nexus's father in his attempt to, follow orders of his kind of, post-Russian Soviet empire that he belongs to. But still, he might have a dream about this guy if, the gods or forces or whatever they are tell him that it's time to take somebody out. And we never know, especially in the early parts of the probably 60 issues on, who or what it is that's causing Nexus to do these things. So it's another good example of both, keeping the tension alive and also planting new possibilities for future issues on Baron's part. I don't know about you, but I never got the sense that Baron was really capable of writing a good book other than Nexus. It's not that he's not talented, but when he went to DC and started writing Flash and he wrote a bunch of other stuff, I think he might have written a little for Marvel, but it was primarily for DC. Maybe he was spreading himself too thin, but the dialogue was still a non-cliche dialogue, but none of the plot interest was there, maybe because he didn't have a chance to build the character himself the way that he and Rude had done it with Nexus.
Did he write Badger?
Yes.
That was published by who?
Well, Capital published it first as a color book. It was never a black and white, and then it moved over to First. And in fact, issues 6 and 7 of and once the comic moves over to First Comics, actually Badger appears as in a kind of crossover, where Nexus and Judah end up in this kind of bowl-shaped world through through a black hole, and they end up meeting up with Badger, who is a character. Psychotic Vietnam vet who's a great fighter but refuses to kill anybody, by the way. Maiming but no killing, he says. He's sort of like a slightly ethical version of Deadpool. Although that's an oxymoron, I realize. But they end up doing a bit of a crossover, and then the following month, I think the same month that this trilogy with Badger ended, Badger, I guess, a curse was put on him by the kind of wizard character who tells him what to do in his world of Wisconsin, circa 1983. At the month of the third issue of this little trilogy within Nexus came out, a 3-part mini series, I guess. Badger started being published by First.
Mm-hmm.
Coming up, the humor in Nexus, similarities to Space Ghost, and more. But first, a reminder to join us for 20th Century TV and music trivia quiz videos and more on our Patreon page. All patrons just got access to our latest music trivia video, in which we discussed Gordon Lightfoot, Kenny Rogers' drummer's side project, and more. Patrons donating $4 a month or more get access to our podcasts on the first 50 issues of The Amazing Spider-Man and our new series on Captain Marvel as rendered by Jim Starlin. But the only way to hear the podcast is to join us at patreon.com/deconcomics for at least $4 a month. We look forward to hearing from you.
Do you like comics? The 1960s? How about middle-aged gay couples gossiping about their neighbors? Then you'll love Checkered Past.
A loving examination of DC's Go-Go Check branded comic magazines published from February 1966 to August 1967.
I'm Dr. Bob.
And I'm Dr. Husband.
And each week we'll be your hosts on a trippy tour through mid-century four-color madness. Checkered Past! Available wherever fine podcasts are downloaded for free.
We haven't talked much about the humor in Nexus, which I know was another thing that I really liked about it back then. Although looking at it now, I think I may have noticed some more subtle humor that I didn't notice back then. There's one spot. Oh, let's see. It's of this book. It's page 188. I guess it's in the fourth color issue. So Dave and Sundra are walking down a hallway, and Dave is talking, and they come through open a door and come through, and everybody outside the doorway is expecting Nexus, and they've all got their fists up in the air, and Dave says, "Sorry, false alarm."
Yeah, there are great moments like that. Yeah, that's right. There are lots of great moments like that. It's sort of like reading a Will Elder story in an old Mad magazine with like hundreds of things going on in the background that it would take like 18 reads to even scratch the surface of. But, at the same, it's not obtrusive because Rude tends to hold those details down to certain kinds of panels, like transitional panels, as people are walking from one place to another within the Island complex and talking about something. Then he'll fill the range of the frame with all kinds of little goofy stuff. Often it's like caricatures. I pointed out to Tim the back cover of the first Capital Comics issue, which is the first color issue, which is a wraparound cover. One of the disembodied heads is the head of Alfred Hitchcock. So they fill in sort of, their favorite cultural references here and there, but then they pull them out of the way when things get serious. Mm-hmm. So, you've got your lightness, but you've also got your heaviness, and the density of the art, as well as how many jokes there are in the background, helps to emphasize that.
Yeah, well, I'd forgotten, but I guess that some Space Ghost characters occasionally appear in the background, because I guess that Rude and Barron were big Space Ghost fans.
Well, I found out reading the, I guess it was the introduction or the afterword to the original Nexus graphic novel from '85. Barron said he'd never heard of Space Ghost before. Rude said, "Can we do Space Ghost?" Ha 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 ha. Rude loved Space Ghost so much that he ended up drawing his dream project for Comico in the mid '80s, which was a Space Ghost. Like a trade paperback or a kind of mini graphic novel, sort of in the same format as Frank Miller's The Dark Knight Returns with the square bound. And that was, I'm sure, a lot of fun for him. But you got to think, looking at the Space Ghost comic book that Rude drew and looking at Nexus, that he was thinking Space Ghost the whole time when drawing Nexus. The sleekness, the kind of Alex Toth perspective, foreshortening of bodies flying through space. It's kind of all there. I wanted to ask you what you think about the kind of bow to superhero-ness of putting a costume on Nexus. According to Barron, writing about the history of the book, he and Rude had come forward with a historical war story that they wanted to get published. And Richard Bruning at Capitol said, "I like it, but we can't do it. It's just not commercially viable. Can you give us a superhero?" And so they came back, but with a superhero only in the sense that he wears a costume and has powers, I guess. Maybe that does make him a superhero. But I guess, drawing a line between kind of hard sci-fi, actually it's not hard sci-fi, there's science in it, but I wouldn't call it Larry Niven's Ringworld or anything when it comes to the necessity of understanding some physics to getting the story. But I'm not sure whether this is, space opera sci-fi or a superhero book or what exactly it is, and maybe it doesn't make any difference, but maybe the fact that it's got this really thick universe in 500 years in the future makes it appeal to sci-fi fans in a way that it wouldn't otherwise. But it doesn't feel like a superhero book in that there's no secret identities to deal with. That sort of, those generic conventions that comic books were, that Marvel had pretty much set the standard for in the early 60s.
Yeah, I think that's right. The costume is just there for commercial appeal, but I think you could do this just as well with a less superhero-y looking outfit. It looks a little he has a visor that looks a little bit like Cyclops' visor and the same sort of head covering. And flashy costume, but yeah,
it's a bow. It's a commercial bow.
Practically, it doesn't mean anything.
Probably. I always thought it was kind of cool that he didn't have any fingers in his gloves. If you're going to blast power beams out of your hands, which of course we know is not the likeliest event, at least you don't want to have to burn through your gloves all the time. So leave your fingers uncovered. Just cut off the fingers of your gloves, before the first knuckle, and it'd probably be a little more practical for your, the people who are making your replacement costumes back on Ilum.
Yeah,
there's a great moment in the origin story. I'll just point this out really quickly. In which Nexus pulls himself out of the tank, this kind of plasma tank, where he crawls and throws himself in after he has these really devastating, painful dreams that sort of rejuvenates him. Again, it's one of those mystery pieces of furniture that came from apparently whoever it is who's forcing him to kill people. And he comes out and in his telling of the story to Sundra, the narration block in quotes says, "The costume was waiting for me." Suddenly it was there, which strikes me as I think Richard Bruning put it there, the editor. Maybe it was a kind of tip of the hat to the fact that this was forced upon them to make him into a superhero, at least visually, is just to sort of kind of jab commercial necessity in the eye by saying, well, the costume just showed up.
There it is. Yeah.
Yep. It was there because Steve Rude drew it. That's as much dramatic motivation as you're going to get.
So, yeah, when I was in college, I kind of stopped reading comics. I guess I did pick up some Nexus again after I graduated in '87. But I hadn't realized that it continued with Dark Horse into the '90s. And they even put out a few issues back in like '07 or something. But and then there are, I guess, Dark Horse put out the whole thing or much of the series in some nice hardcovers, which are still on Amazon, kind of expensive. I'm thinking I might buy used copies of some of them.
At this point, the back issues, and this is not just for you, Tim, but for everybody, back issues of this book are so inexpensive. If you go to Lone Star, you go to Mile High, pretty much any other kind of big kind of back issue warehouse, you're going to find like issue number 1 for like $3.
Wow.
And so, they're just not worth a lot. This always seems to be the problem somehow with like really critically acclaimed comics. And make no mistake, Nexus was hugely critically acclaimed. That reboot of the origin story that they did for Dark Horse back in 2003 or 4, the Nexus Origin or whatever it was called, that Root and Baron reunited to do, won an Eisner Award for like best single issue. And I got it for like $1.80. 20 years after it was published almost.
Yeah, well, it seems like I hardly ever hear anyone talk about it, or it seems to have been largely forgotten. Seems kind of odd now because it was kind of a big deal when it started.
Yeah, it was really but this is kind of the case with even things like Dark Knight Returns, the first issue. Some folks investing would have thought that the book would be worth $500 by now, and it's worth, maybe in like pristine condition, it's worth, maybe you probably get like $75 for it. The Watchmen issues are not very expensive, even in pretty pristine condition. The critically acclaimed stuff doesn't necessarily like sell well as the next edition of Deadpool #1. Go figure. I guess this is the difference between thinking in terms of art and thinking in terms of markets. But the good news is you could probably get the whole series a lot less expensively just by buying the comics than by buying the hardcovers. Although the hardcovers are the nice kind of Marvel, they're very much like the Marvel reprint hardcovers, whatever they call them, the collector's editions of like Fantastic Four 1 through 10 and X-Men 1 through 10 and all of those. But yeah, I mean, they're nice to have around, but the comics look just as good as any reprint edition would, I think. Yeah. But the comic gets weird. I mean, Rude leaves after about 20, maybe 30 or 40 issues, and he always is going on hiatus, I think because he was doing other stuff. He did a World's Finest comics miniseries for DC. And I think he was getting more and more elaborate and therefore a lot slower in the way that he drew and how he was able to get stuff out. So they had a whole slew of mediocre, some very good, some mostly mediocre, some just truly bad artists working on Nexus when Mike Baron was just soldiering through with every single script for years. And the story really suffers. It feels like Baron is just trying, desperately to hold the book together. But he's got stick figures, attempting to stand in for what used to be these gorgeous layouts, like the ones that Tim and I were talking about before. So, maybe some books just outlive their usefulness even to the artists. Maybe something should have happened to kind of close Nexus off for good a long time ago. But looking back over these first few color issues, I actually read up to issue number 7 last night getting ready for this. So I read all 3 of the black and whites and then the first 7 color issues. Totally sucked into it again. It's just so much fun to read. It just whizzes by, and then you go back and kind of savor the line art and the color and the occasional brilliant dialogue and non-cliched dialogue almost exclusively. I think there's some great stuff here. If Baron ever does a cliche, it's for humor. Anyway.
Yeah.
I'm just effusing about how much we loved this book when we were kids, but it's worth going back to. There's no doubt.
Yeah, and I think it has aged a lot better and reads a lot better than most early 80s comics.
Yeah, there's something about the way that they do the sci-fi where they're not, clearly it's supposed to be 500 years in our future. So it's our dimension. Earth is a big player. Ursula, who's kind of the enemy of Sundra, is from an agency in something called the Web, which is a kind of federation of planets. And so Earth, she's from Earth and she operates from Earth. And so Earth is always sort of calling and pulling them back. And apparently Horatio and his father and mother, well, not his mother, she was an alien of some kind, but they were also Earthers, expatriates or settlers on another planet. But there's not a lot of expectation in the book, or not a lot of sort of, what's the word I'm looking for? Not a lot of attempting to develop new technologies out of present technologies and then end up looking really dated, 20 years down the road, or, however long one is away from it before going back to it. So there's like one reference to tapes, videotapes. Like, Nexus says early on, I'd like to watch this wrestling match. It's too bad it takes so long for the tapes to get here. But, that's one reference to something that doesn't exist anymore. But on the other hand, there could be digital tapes of some kind in the far-flung future that are more, reliable than CDs or whatever. But there's not a lot of that kind of specificity that makes some sci-fi look incredibly dated. Like the original Star Trek, God loves it. I love that stuff. I'm sure that God feels the same way. I'm not quite sure why I said that. But the mini skirts that are supposed to be kind of the clothing of the future, they look like the 60s. But that doesn't really happen here. The imaginativeness of the technology and of even of the costumes and everything feels like they're really part of a universe and not just a kind of extension of what we expect of our future technologies and our future fashions and everything else. That's probably why it looks undated as well as feeling undated as a story.
Yeah. Okay, so basically we really recommend this, so find it in any form you can get it in, I guess.
Yes, and read it, and perhaps you will become enough of a fan that you can start a letter writing campaign, or perhaps chip in $5 to Rude Dude Productions and get a lot of other people to do the same, and maybe they'll publish a second issue, or issue 102, I guess it would be now, of their attempted reboot. I'm not sure if it's ever going to happen. Apparently, Rude and Barron didn't get along for a number of years, and now they're sort of reconciled, so maybe there will be a future for it, maybe there won't, but I would say that the first 30 or so issues that are just like Barron and Rude are worth getting whatever you have to pay. And luckily, you don't have to pay very much. It's a piece of comics history that has influenced other cartoonists in ways that I don't think are very clear because we haven't paid much attention to the original.
Yeah. Okay.
So, and read some Dostoevsky for Pete's sake. Not you. I'm talking to everybody who's listening. If you want to really get what Barron is working from, you need some literary history, and read some Nietzsche, too. I think that would be useful to all of you. Just don't believe everything you read.
Nexus is currently published by Dark Horse. If you're enjoying our comics discussion every week, consider supporting this podcast by joining us on Patreon at patreon.com/deconcomics, and go to deconstructingcomics.com to connect to us on Twitter, Facebook, or YouTube, to shop on Amazon to support the show, and to find links to subscribe to the podcast. You can comment on any episode there, or drop us a line at mail@deconstructingcomics.com. That's also the address for submitting your own comics work for possible inclusion on our spin-off podcast, Critiquing Comics. Our theme is by J.B. Anderton. Next week, in Part 2 of Justifiable Homicide, Naoki Urasawa's Monster. Set in Germany, the series focuses on the unintended consequences of Dr. Kenzo Tenma's good deed. He saved the life of a boy who turned out to be a remorseless killer. Guest reviewer Natalie Noragat joins me to discuss in this flashback episode from 2011. Till then, this is Tim, and thanks for listening to Deconstructing Comics.